You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at TeachThought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes TeachThought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and a few housekeeping notes here as you're listening to this podcast about the research and thinking about the research of project-based learning. If you are interested in project-based learning, please check out our PBL Grow 18 summer event, which will be this July 9th through 11, and an optional fourth day that we're very excited to add this year to the 12th. So days 1, 2, and 3, 9, 10th, and 11th will be on project-based learning, design, assessment, and management. You'll be creating a project to implement in your classroom with some very cool keynote speakers and some other pieces that we're excited to share. But then we also have the optional fourth day on July 12th to extend that thinking, which will be around differentiation in PBL. And if you are an advanced PBL practitioner or perhaps attended Grow 17 last year and have a project that you'd like to bring and dive into extending that, you're welcome to sign up for just the July 12th date. All of that information is available on wegrowteachers.com. You'll find along the top and several other places where you can click to get to wegrowteachers.com/grow18. Also, something to note, we have added a new feature on the TeachThought Professional Development website called the Education Jobs Board. It's just getting started, so we're hoping to gain some momentum, and hopefully it will be a helpful service for schools and educators. If you are a school looking for an innovative educator and you have a position that you'd like to post, please send that our way. And if you are an innovative educator looking for an opportunity or for a new job, please feel free to send us your resume and information and tell us why you think you are an innovative educator, and we'll post that as well. So hopefully we can help schools and innovative educators match up and continue to do great work around the world. In today's podcast, I spoke with Barbara Condliffe, who is a research associate with MDRC, and she tells you a little bit more about that work in her own self-introduction. But I was particularly excited to talk with her because of her work in sort of digging up and sharing the research around the effectiveness of project-based learning, which is kind of hit or miss. So we really first of all started to talk about defining what makes PBL and sort of having some common language around those things, then talked more about what makes it work and maybe what makes it not work, and sort of how you define something as far as is it effective, and then some of the things that would help to make the implementation of PBL effective, and sort of finished off by talking about the future of the research around project-based learning and thinking about whether schools should do PBL, and if so, how, and what are some of the professional development innovations and solutions and things that help to make it more successful. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Welcome to the podcast. Today I have with me Barbara Condliffe, who is a research associate at MDRC, which we have no idea what that means off the top of her head, so I'm going to give her an opportunity. She's calling in via Skype from New York City. Give her an opportunity. Barbara, tell us your backstory, how you got started in education, and how you got to where you are now as a research associate, as well as what MDRC is and the kind of work that you do.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, Drew. So MDRC, MDRC is our name. We used to be the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, but now are officially MDRC. So we are a nonprofit social policy research organization. We're based in New York City, with offices in Oakland, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. And our mission is to develop and evaluate programs and policies that aim to improve the lives of low-income people. We work in a number of different areas. I focus specifically on K-12 education, which speaks to my personal background. I started my career as a middle school and high school English teacher. So I spent 4 great and exhausting years in the classroom, and then moved on to pursue a career in research. So I've been at MDRC now for a little over 3 years, and have really appreciated the opportunity to conduct research with the goal of the research being useful to practitioners as well as policymakers.
Great. And yeah, I just as sort of a point of reference for the appreciation for teachers, as I worked in classroom for 15 years, but have been out of the classroom for several in the work that I do. But I had an opportunity to volunteer in my daughter's classroom as we were working on, of all things, project-based learning. The frenetic nature of a 5th grade teacher's classroom reminded me of the how difficult teaching is. So absolutely, I think we can both say thank you to all the teachers and the frenetic nature and the, like you said, exhaustive procedures and processes and so forth. So anyways,
yes,
yeah,
sure.
So what I'd like to do is, and I really am very interested for our listeners who ask us on a pretty regular basis about project-based learning and the lots of the work that we do with schools around the country and around the world is project-based learning, workshops and training and support and facilitation. And we quite often get questions like, so what does the research say, right? So when I saw your work come across my screen, I thought, I really need to talk with this person and learn more about what you all have learned. So I'd like to kind of start with a definition or how to operationalize, if you will, how you defined PBL, because that is a bit ambiguous in the education world. Certainly we get lots of people who say, I've been doing project-based learning for years, and it's not what we would call project-based learning. So how did you define that?
Yeah, great question. And I will say I was one of those teachers who said I was doing project-based learning, and then as I did this work, I was like, oh, wait, no, I wasn't.
Right.
So I hear that. So this work that we did was we conducted a literature review, and we, with support from Lucas Education Research of the George Lucas Educational Foundation. And this gave us the opportunity to take a look at the research from starting in 2000. And in 2000, Thomas put out a really comprehensive literature review. So we wanted to kind of provide a chance to update that literature review. And really our first question was exactly what you just asked, Drew, was this question of what is project-based learning?
Right.
And so to define project-based learning, we really turn to what's often called in the research literature, the design principles behind project-based learning. Because the concept is truly broad, and it's not like there's a governing body out there saying,
right.
This is and this isn't project-based learning. So I think these design principles are really useful to teachers and to those of us in research in figuring out sort of when am I doing something that would be considered project-based learning, or when am I observing project-based learning and when am I not. And what we found in our review of the many design principles that are out there, and sometimes they're called things like critical components or essential features, is that there's agreement in the field on some pretty core and important issues that I can talk about. And then there are areas where there seem to be among researchers and practitioners either some disagreement, or some folks think that certain aspects of project-based learning are really critical to focus on and would elevate them to the level of design principles that are just not emphasized in others.
Yeah.
So the areas that we that we saw as being pretty universal across these design principles that we reviewed. One is somewhat obvious, right? That project-based learning involves a project. So students will be working on a series of projects. But what's important here is that, unlike sometimes the work I was doing as a teacher, projects are not done as the culmination of learning, like as your final project or a final assessment, but instead are really the vehicle through which learning occurs. And that relates to a second somewhat universal design principle, that PBL is really rooted in the constructivist approach to learning. So rather than teachers delivering knowledge to students, students are engaged in in-depth inquiry with support of a teacher that supports their construction of knowledge. So it really has a somewhat, a different philosophical underpinning than other approaches to student learning.
Right, and that's if I could stop you there. So there's a couple things that are really sort of jumping out at me, and as you're talking about the project and learning through the project, the idea of creating something and asking students to create something is one of those things, as I'm understanding, because that's some of the language that we use is what we call our levers, and like you said, there are different sort of approaches and models that use different language, but that we're asking the students to create something and start at the top of that Bloom's taxonomy, if you will, and that driving question is posing a challenge where they're creating, and that verb could be different from creating, but essentially it's all about creating something, producing something, and learning through that. But then the inquiry process and what we call rich inquiry, or others in-depth inquiry, that is that sort of pull as opposed to push teaching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that pull push makes a lot of sense, that we're really that in-depth inquiry is pulling the student through, and I think relates to another idea that we saw in a lot of design principles, which was this question of sort of how involved should the teacher be, how much scaffolding does a teacher need to offer. And so, particularly in some other models of inquiry-based learning, you might see a real emphasis on very, very limited teacher involvement. Some folks talk about, though, the importance of teacher scaffolds, and so that requires a teacher to really understand and know where her students are and what supports they might need to be able to independently move through that inquiry process. And there's a lot of literature out there about the importance of not only providing those well-tailored scaffolds, but then figuring out how to fade those scaffolds over time so that the teacher is becoming, somewhat more and more in the background, or those scaffolds, rather, those materials, technologies might be becoming more in the background, and the student can more independently move through the process on their own. So I think that becomes a real challenge, figuring out how to design and use those scaffolds, but was another theme that we saw emerge in many of the design principles.
Yeah, I think that's a real piece that is, as we think about project-based learning, and I recently did a podcast with Riley Johnson, who's a principal at New Tech School out in Napa, and I really appreciated some of his language, and his blog is great, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. But thinking about this as a process and not just you sort of either black or white, that you are doing project-based learning or not, but it's a matter of sort of being in pursuit of doing it better and better, and there's sort of a sliding scale, a spectrum, and that's also true for the students. And as we think about and the planning process, and when we work with teachers, really trying to help them understand the sort of the concepts behind it, like you're saying, the inquiry and the driving question that's pulling out need to knows, and that we're asking them to create something, but also really being intentional about your planning and that scaffolding in a way that leaves you prepared to and I would say that's sort of the science of teaching, leaves you prepared to demonstrate the art of teaching, where you're just supporting them at just enough, like you sort of described it as sort of fading out, but there's a differentiation there. It's like, how do you know as a teacher when to sort of push a little bit more and provide a bit more support and scaffolding and teaching, as opposed to allowing them to construct and make meaning of it themselves by asking them questions and giving them the opportunities to think through it themselves. So I think it's really important, at least from our perspective, we found that it's really important for teachers to do that scaffolding, to be really almost explicit and over-prepared in that scaffolding, so that they can then step back and demonstrate the art of teaching, which is what you said, sort of fading out as necessary.
Absolutely.
So does that exhaust the list of sort of things that there's universal agreement?
Yeah, I think you touched on one that is also really important, that we saw this sort of driving question, what some call facilitating the need to know,
right,
as really, and that driving question needing to be authentic and meaningful. So there's a lot of talk in the research literature and some debate as well about whether design principles for project-based learning should focus on content. So ensuring that we're designing project-based learning units on really meaningful content, that it not necessarily is an approach that should be used universally for content that wouldn't really lend itself to PBL. So I think that authentic and meaningful piece of the driving question is important. Another issue that does come across a lot in the design principles that we've touched on a little is this issue of assessment, and the importance of assessment also being authentic and meaningful for students. So in some design principles, it's emphasized the importance of having a public audience for students to sort of demonstrate their learning. The importance of students creating sort of artifacts along the way from their work. And built into that, I think really builds nicely on the literature that we know that's sort of beyond just PBL, of the importance for teachers to have multiple opportunities throughout a student's learning experience to offer meaningful feedback. And so designing those meaningful, authentic assessments that provide teachers opportunity to give that feedback is another feature that is not mentioned in all design principles, but somewhat implicit throughout in the ones that talk about the importance of assessment.
Yeah, so the authenticity piece is one that we get questions about a lot, and I'm wondering what you found or what your feeling is about how you define authenticity.
That's a good question. I think in some cases, it seems that authenticity is related to this piece on something being really meaningful and applicable to the real world. So in some ways, it's really related to that driving question, right? That if we're going to have, as you say, the inquiry process really pulling students along, what they are producing along the way and at the end really does need to be meaningful to them and applicable to the real world. So I'd say that's one definition perhaps of authenticity. But I do think that's a good question, and I could imagine that it may differ somewhat by subject area, by teacher, and by the interests of the student population as well. So I think that's a tough question.
Yeah.
But there are,
Yeah, it is a really tough question, and as we work with teachers, I think it's helpful to think about it again as a spectrum and as almost again a sort of ideal. And we in our project-based learning model, we don't think about them as standards, but as ideals, because we're constantly in pursuit of them, and authenticity is one of those. But not every project has the same level of authenticity, of course. So. Is it authentic to the real world would be the sort of the highest sort of standard or ideal, but also thinking about whether it is authentic to the discipline and then of course to the student. And for us, thinking about in what way is the audience using this or needing it or asking for it, or is it sort of something that is useful and utilitarian as opposed to just creating it. I think the maybe it's sometimes helpful to think about it in the opposite of what is inauthentic, and that is something that's for a grade or for points or for the teacher or the dreaded "you're going to need this in the future," which I jokingly, say like high school students, for example, that's Friday, so it's really, that doesn't resonate with most of them. So that is, I think, there's lots of room for exploration and thoughtfulness about that. And even when students are creating something that is, for example, not successful, so they create something that's in their project or product is not successful. So, let's say they were trying to persuade a legislator to vote a certain way with some sort of letter writing campaign or something, and if they're not successful, it doesn't mean it's inauthentic. It's the example I use is that scientists for how many decades have been trying to cure cancer unsuccessfully. That doesn't mean it's an inauthentic pursuit. So I do think that that's there's some ambiguity and some room for defining that in a way that it could mean different things to different people, and I think that it's sometimes a struggle for teachers to grasp that, depending on their grade level. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but the thinking about especially higher level math and creating authentic products is much more of a challenge. So yeah,
absolutely. And I think you mentioned a good point there too about that is also critical to the assessment piece, and that opportunity not just for teacher feedback but also student reflection. So you have an experience like the one that you described, where a student might feel discouraged that seemingly their product wasn't successful in the sense of achieving its ultimate goal of persuading a legislature or whatever it may be.
Right.
And that really providing along the way those opportunities for students to reflect both on their product, on their learning, on why they're doing what they're doing, is really tied up in the literature also with that, and goes hand in hand with those opportunities for student feedback, and how students really should be learning through their assessments, not just rather than it just being a demonstration of sort of what they know at the end of at the end of a unit or at the end of a lesson.
Right, and you had mentioned in what you were talking about there with authenticity, and I thought it was interesting, is you sort of threw in the idea of content and how much content or what content, and so how does that play, or what did your findings and the research that you looked at show or think about the role of content in project-based learning?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think from the look at the research literature, particularly the research that's been done on student outcomes, we found that there has been a lot more work on research, particularly on science, or in using project-based learning in the science classroom, and similarly. Recently also some research on using it in the social studies classroom, where we found less examples of implementation and particularly outcome studies was the use of project-based learning in sort of math and literacy classrooms. There are some studies, but I think somewhat less developed, at least in the research literature, which was certainly interesting to me as a former English teacher. But I think perhaps speaks to some of the challenges, particularly in many of the school environments where there's a lot of pressure on standardized testing, to some challenges teachers might perceive in using PBL for sort of more skill-based instruction as opposed to development of content knowledge. And so, although like in a social studies classroom, there's certainly literacy skills that students are developing, the English teacher may feel more pressure, for example, to develop some skills related to literacy. And it may be more challenging to think about how you can take this constructivist inquiry approach to developing those skills with students.
That's a really interesting piece to me, because it seems to me my intuition would be that it would be the exact opposite. And I sometimes get English language arts teachers who ask me, or say in a workshop, for example, I think that ELA is really hard to do PBL, and I say, well, I would think it would be quite easy because, and precisely because how you describe that it is more skill based as opposed to sort of a history teacher, which is at least in some classrooms, and I don't happen to think that history should be taught like this, but it is a set of facts and perhaps even a timeline, whereas English language arts often, like you said, is sort of skills, and that to me means that you could come at it from so many different angles. And so it seems to me like English language arts would be one of the easiest ways, but I wonder how much of that, and I don't know if your research showed any of this or if you have any personal thoughts on this, is are we approaching the teaching of English language arts the wrong way, or should we be doing it differently? Just like I think we should be teaching history differently. Like to me, it's less important to know all the facts of history, but to know why and really think about the dynamics and the big pieces. And I think the same thing about ELA. So why is Shakespeare important? I think it's less important to be able to recite Shakespeare than it is to be able to think about the big themes of what it means to be a human and those kinds of things, and then use those in other, sort of transfer those thoughts, and essentially it's a skill in a way, right? So I don't know. I don't know if you found anything in your research or if you have any personal thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I don't think the research literature speaks necessarily exactly to that question of why, and I should say that what we found was that when we looked at research studies on project-based learning, there was more in particularly regarding student outcomes on science and social studies than there was on literacy and math. That does not mean that it's being used more commonly in social studies and science classrooms in the real world. It just might be sort of where the research literature is. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Right.
And something we highlight is really lacking in the literature, that we need a better understanding. We know that probably the most common use of project-based learning is not teachers necessarily adopting some externally developed curriculum, but teachers really initiating PBL themselves and designing lessons and units themselves. And so we do need a better handle in the research on the challenges teachers faced with that and the effectiveness of those approaches. Putting that aside, I do think, and this is not from the research, this is from my personal experience, for what it's worth. I do think one challenge with what you were describing, for example, in your example about Shakespeare, is for an English teacher, for example, who may have students with a range of skill levels in the classroom and faces standardized tests at the end of the year where they'll be assessed on very specific and discrete literacy skills.
Mm-hmm.
I think there can be a challenge there, and that often, at least in my classroom, the focus ended up being probably too much on really those skills as opposed to some of those larger questions around, around sort of the themes that that literature bring up for us, which I would agree would lend themselves well to project-based learning. I think there are likely also out there some really innovative approaches to, even if you are a teacher who really needs to focus on vocabulary development or issues of related to grammar, reading comprehension, that there are ways we can use project-based learning to support those goals. And in fact, in this recent issue brief we put out about our longer, not so brief working paper, we were able to take a look at some of the recent research out there. And Nell Duke and colleagues are currently conducting an evaluation of a social studies curriculum. So it is, again, that social studies focus. But they are looking specifically at how a PBL social studies curriculum can can address and improve students' literacy skills. So really building evidence, sort of hopefully, I think their study is still going on, but looking to build evidence around challenges that might be faced in this approach, as well as effects on student outcomes of curricula that is focused not only on sort of concept development and knowledge development in students, but also perhaps some concrete skills as well.
So I think it's probably worth getting your definition, or when you're talking about measuring the effectiveness of PBL, what were sort of the criteria for how you defined effective, or when you say it worked or it didn't work, or when the research that you looked at saw that it said that it worked or didn't work? Was there agreement on how that was measured, or what was that?
Yes. So I think, one thing we looked at when we considered studies that were looking at sort of student outcomes, so how did students do as a result of the PBL curriculum, was one first thing we look at is the research methodology. So particularly for approaches like project-based learning, which some would say is like an innovative approach, we always have concerns in the research that if you are simply looking at how were students doing before the curriculum was implemented versus how are they doing afterwards, or if you're maybe taking a school or group of teachers who used a PBL curriculum and comparing them to teachers who didn't, we're always concerned about things that researchers call selection bias, but really what that means is what I think we'd all intuit, which is that maybe those who sort of decided to use project-based learning might be different in ways from those who didn't, and maybe the students would have done just as well if the teacher had used a different curriculum or a different approach than they did with the project-based learning. It's hard with those types of research designs to attribute it to PBL itself. And of course, a number of researchers in this field have done a lot of things to sort of mitigate those concerns, and we talk about those in the research. But there have been, and there also though have been some what's often called the gold standard in evaluation research, so randomized control trials that have had some promising results, and again, particularly on in science and some social studies curricula. I think what's hard about making sort of broad conclusions, and why we say PBL is promising but not yet proven, is going back to the thing we started talking about when we started our conversation, that if I evaluate one PBL curriculum and I use rigorous research methodologies, and you evaluate a different PBL curriculum, but what we're calling PBL really means sort of two different things. Right. It becomes really difficult to say to then a teacher who's asking, will PBL work, that their use of PBL really will match what the research evidence says has been effective. Right. So I think that's one reason why the sort of vagueness around the term PBL creates some challenges in drawing conclusions about the effectiveness.
And what are the outcomes, or is there a consistency of outcomes that have been deemed as, well, this was successful or more successful than others? I mean, obviously test scores is something that is prevalent across, all of the platforms. I think many of us would disagree that is necessarily effective, but certainly it's a measure. Are there other measures as well? Student happiness, student engagement, empowerment. I mean, what are those pieces?
Yeah, that's another really important point. So I think another reason why there are some limitations in this research that a lot of studies currently and a lot of work being done are trying to overcome is that there's a concern that the measures that are out there that are easy for us researchers to capture and easy to sort of for people to administer are really not appropriate to what the PBL curriculum is trying to support. So a standardized test might give us an easy test score that we can use for our research,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily capture the goals of the PBL curriculum. And so there have been some studies where the researchers, and sometimes in collaboration with teachers, have designed tests that really get at those more higher level thinking skills that a PBL curriculum is often trying to affect. So things like problem solving skills, performance-based assessments, so sort of having students demonstrate maybe their collaboration skills, are other kinds of measures that can be used. And there are also some work being done on some exciting work actually currently being done where they are developing, I think it's Joe Krajak and Barbara Schneider in partnership with folks at the University of Helsinki, are working on a study where they are designing a new measure of student engagement using smartphone technology, actually, I believe, to try and capture what we also know is a really important piece of PBL, right? That you might have students who are more engaged in school, engaged in the curriculum, engaged in what they're learning, which could have positive effects that, not only of engagement, but
Sure.
sort of ripple effects down the line.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a real challenge, and you've pointed some of those things out. It's again, we get teachers and administrators who ask us, so how effective is PBL? Can you give me can you give me examples of where it's done well? And what I often say is that there are few examples, especially research and research done well. There's some anecdotal stuff and that some fantastic videos, but how do we? What happens, or what tends to happen in our schools, is that nothing really happens at a high level, at least not for very long, as far as professional development. And I don't know what your findings would reflect as far as making PBL more effective, but I'm curious to see if there was any data on how long the sort of PBL implementation plans typically lasted. But I tend to think of it as like a 3 to 5 year sort of curve of growth between all of the stakeholders in that education ecosystem, because you've got students who aren't used to it in many cases, teachers who are shifting their teaching style and some of their pedagogy. You've got administration, you've got parents, you've got board members, you've got hopefully business and industry partners, all of those pieces. And if you do it for a year and a half, and then it sort of peters out because you have a new superintendent, or the next shiny object comes along, it doesn't really take hold, never really gets going the way that it should be. So the research would show there that it wasn't particularly effective. But I don't know if your research, I'm curious if your research did find any of that sort of dynamic at play.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think we did certainly look at many of the implementation challenges that a lot of the qualitative work and some of the case studies have highlighted really nicely in the research. And one of those pieces, an important one, is one that you touched on, which is school context. So there are a lot of instances of PBL where you'll have what we called before sort of teacher-initiated PBL, where a teacher on their own initiative, or maybe a small group of teachers, are planning PBL lessons, and their classrooms might be really different from what's happening for the students in the rest of the school. And those teachers may or may not have the support of professional development, training, and coaching, which makes embarking on something like project-based learning, which many of us probably didn't experience as students in
Right.
our own, when we were in school,
Right.
that much more challenging. So I do think the research really does highlight the importance, and I will say that those studies that have been done where when they have found positive effects of of a PBL curriculum, such as project-based inquiry science, this PBIS model, and have included robust professional development. as part of the model. In addition, there are some whole school reform models, and we review some of them in the paper, that include project-based learning as sort of a school-wide approach to instruction. And oftentimes that, PBL is just one facet of a school's, overall reform model and philosophy.
Right.
But it does seem that lends itself to facilitators of implementation that are true for PBL and other reforms where, if this is something the whole school is doing, you have administrative support, resources to implement, the likelihood of high quality implementation would seem to increase. And that's sort of, as you were saying, that 3 to 5 years. I don't know of research specific to PBL that speaks to how long a teacher needs to have been doing project-based learning for it to be effective. But that does make a lot of sense, right? And that particularly you're more likely to sustain a practice if it's really embedded in that school culture and the school organization.
Right. I mean, it is so often true of not just PBL professional development, but any professional development. And I think there's some shifts happening, but it's very much in the sort of the style and the model of how we have worked with students, in that the content and often what happens with professional development, of course, is that there's something, there's a workshop and there's not the follow-up, and there's certainly some education PD that doesn't need extended follow-up, but something, the shift that most teachers undergo with project-based learning needs to be something that is supported on a long-term basis, an ongoing and constant basis, so that they are given the opportunity not just to get started, but to grow their craft and their teaching practice and reflect and collaborate and those kinds of things. I'm curious if you saw any examples in the research of what you might say approached sort of what a good professional development implementation plan might look like, or if you could glean any insights or say, if I were going to do it, it would include these elements or these pieces, and these things would be important for an implementation plan.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I think what hasn't been done, and I think what would be incredibly useful, is looking at different models of professional development, perhaps different intensities and different modalities, maybe perhaps using the same curriculum and trying to really tease out what is most effective for promoting teacher implementation and eventually student outcomes. I think what we did learn was a number of different approaches that are out there, and some that seem particularly have really been developed, it seems, in the PBL space. So one in particular is a discussion of educative curriculum materials, which appears a good deal in the literature on PBL in the science classroom. And the idea there is that the curriculum materials that a teacher receives, rather than just simply being rather than just a teacher guide that tells you, use these strategies in the classroom as you're implementing this curriculum. And, we've all seen those that kind of even script out what you might say to students.
Right.
That really are educative to teachers. So they're not in the curriculum materials. They're not only sort of providing teachers with strategies to support their students. They're also promoting teacher knowledge and improving teachers' understanding of why they are undertaking certain activities with their students. And might include things like video demonstrations for the teachers to get them to watch other teachers enacting this. So that seems to be one innovative approach I hadn't heard of before, but learned about specific in relation to PBL. And I also think something we haven't touched on here, which is related to professional development, is the importance of adaptation. So particularly when you have a PBL curriculum that might be externally developed that a teacher is borrowing from, some of the PBL design principles really see it as important that teachers be empowered to adapt those materials to sort of meet their students' needs, to fit their own teaching style and sort of knowledge and strengths. At the same time, there is caution in the research literature about how sometimes adaptations can sort of end up unintentionally somewhat undermining the goals of the PBL curriculum. So, for example, if you have a teacher who ends up adapting a curriculum so that it really becomes more about teachers demonstrating a skill and knowledge to student as opposed to students sort of developing and discovering that on their own, in some ways that's kind of undermining what might be at the root of that curriculum. So I think professional development and sort of coaching is a way to both empower teachers to engage in that adaptation, but to do so in a way that's really productive and speaks to the original intent of the curriculum.
Yeah, I think that you're spot on there. At least it hits the sort of matches with the intuition and some of the work that we've been doing. And I was actually just having a very similar conversation with an instructional coach friend of mine who had seen me work with project-based learning in my classroom, and we were talking about what seems to be there's such a wide disparity in skill level of teachers, partially I think because, and I think this is really problematic in our teacher pre-service programs, is that there's so many teacher pre-service programs that seem to be producing teachers who have never had to or had been given the opportunity or needed to craft and create lessons and units. And so they sort of not only did they not get this sort of inquiry constructivist approach in school, they're not sort of practicing it as teacher pre-service programs. And so just the skill of doing a need to know list. So here's your driving question: what do we need to know? And how do we get the content and skills that I want to teach and really need to teach in this project, assuming that there is specific content and skills and it's not a genius hour or sort of passion project that is void of accountability. But the importance of, or the skill of being able to do that, I actually saw somebody do that recently and thought that teacher would be much better at it, and I was sort of a little, quite honestly, stunned and shocked that skill wasn't there. So that disparity there, that I think is a skill gap, and there's other skill gaps, and so that the way to help sort of alleviate some of those or fill in and differentiate and help and support those is through coaching. And so one of the things that we really value and think can be helpful is we do virtual coaching, so Skype and Hangouts, because we want to be able to be thought partners when they need help, not in March when the next PD day is. So getting professional development that is sort of ongoing, as you mentioned, sort of that coaching model, and really more importantly, building that capacity internally so that they can have those conversations and coach each other, or there's instructional leadership that is able to coach and that kind of thing. And then you mentioned this modification. I had the opportunity to work with some teachers recently, and we have planning documents that are in some ways similar to some of the other PD providers who do PBL work, but there's some differences. But I said, here's the planning document that we have, and they're on Google Docs and they're PDFs and things like that. But I said, if you need to modify this, then modify it, because this needs to work for you. And the teacher was a little bit shocked and actually said, so you mean we don't have to do this exactly the way that you said it? And I said, no, the planning form is meant for you to work and think through the process. Now, what will happen is when we reconvene in a coaching context, I think it's important now that we say, whether you made modifications or not, the systems that are in place to think about what makes for quality, effective project-based learning, how are you doing that, whether you've modified it or not? But those ideals, those goals that we're after are consistent, and you can get to them in many different ways because teachers have different approaches. So I don't know, you hit on several pieces there that sort of piqued my interest.
Yes, definitely.
So as you think about the study of project-based learning, what are sort of the takeaways and recommendations that or hopes, and you've hit on a few of them, of what you think maybe future research might hit on, but sort of the big picture here?
Yeah. Well, I think we outline a number of different, sort of a long wish list for research.
Mm-hmm.
I think going back to the beginning of our conversation, I think continuing for the research literature to really be paying attention to PBL design principles and making sure that both for teachers and for researchers that those design principles are sort of actionable and measurable to really help us all know when we are seeing or when we are doing PBL and when we are not. Another recommendation we have is that there are a number of examples in the research literature, particularly the research that's been done on sort of researcher-developed PBL curriculum, where the design principles have been a collaborative effort between the sort of researchers and theorists and practitioners. And sort of, we think that's really important as the PBL field continues and expands, that these lofty, sometimes design principles really be informed by practice and by teacher voice. When it comes to implementation research, so better understanding the challenges teachers face in their implementation and sort of what can help support teachers in their implementation of PBL, we think, as we were talking earlier, that it's really important to investigate these different models of professional development. So as you were talking about, virtual coaching versus in-person support, educative materials, perhaps in combination with other things. So there are a number of different research designs that could really help us understand sort of both the effectiveness and perhaps efficiency of those different approaches, and that seems like a really practical piece and important. I think two other things quickly related to implementation. We haven't talked a whole lot about the use of technology in a PBL classroom, but we did see a lot of examples of technology being used in really innovative ways as part of a PBL approach, oftentimes as one of those learning scaffolds or as a piece of a tool for a learning scaffold that we talked about a bit in the beginning. And so I think continuing to think through or do research on the practical ways in which teachers can apply technology to a PBL classroom, as well as some pitfalls that they may encounter as they do so, and practices to overcome them. So there is a lot of work out there in that space, and I think as the field continues to grow, that will be important to pay attention to. And I think lastly, we've been talking a lot about the challenges of planning for a PBL curriculum. And, this thing we call teacher-initiated PBL, which is, as it sounds like you guys do a lot of work on, really supporting teachers in developing their own project-based learning units and curricula.
Right.
But there's not as much sort of research on there about how do we support teachers to do that, what's the effectiveness of that approach. So I think that could really move the field forward.
So the PD part, if you will?
I think the PD part, but honestly, I think also just, descriptively, I think it would be really useful to the field for teachers, for there to be more models and examples out there of ways in which, instances of teachers undergoing this work, and particularly the challenges they may or may not face in the planning process. Could be instructive.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right on that, and teachers consistently ask for examples, and partially because they want to see what it looks like and sounds like and feels like, but also I think should be a practice that, so you're talking about the sort of the educative curriculums or sort of almost canned PBL, which is a little bit, I say that sort of tongue in cheek because good PBL doesn't usually come in a can kind of thing, but there is real value, I think, in teachers talking through and sort of analyzing and evaluating the approach and a lesson or a unit, whether it's one of those or as we do in our workshops, we often show a short video and say, what did you like about that and what did you see, and let's talk about how it met our design principles and those kinds of things. And of course, it's really hard for teachers to do that because one, they're not used to it. Two, they don't have the time and often the structures and the norms and practices. So, those things also need to change in the ecosystem. So I guess that brings me to one of my final questions here, and I'm mindful of your time, but thinking about things that you found as far as any recommendations or if you had a wish list for how curriculum and accountability and or systems and what schools look like, as far as day to day and hour to hour and planning periods and all of that, any sort of wish lists that you sort of came away with and said, boy, I wish this would happen. I think PBL would be much more successful if this happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think as we talked about, we need to better understand the way that school context, so the way schools are organized, from the level of how teachers are sort of scheduled to spend their time, to leadership support, to sort of professional learning that happens within schools, how that all influences PBL implementation and outcomes. So I'm not sure at this stage that I'd have, based on the research literature, sort of a wish list for things to happen, but right. I think we'd certainly like to see continued attention to that in the research. And I think from like a very practical standpoint, another important somewhat hole in the research that is really, there is increasing work on this issue, is getting back to, the question you said a lot of your listeners ask, which is, does it work?
Right.
So we've talked a lot about, we first need to be able to say, what is PBL? How do you do it? But then getting to the question of, and what its effect on student outcomes. And we think there has been a lot of, good research done in this area on specific curricula, but there's a long way to go using, rigorous research methodologies that can really get us to a level of evidence that folks can believe in, to also in tandem with kind of continuing to pay attention to developing measures that are appropriate to the goals of a PBL curriculum seem really critical to moving the research forward. And then finally, I'd say, I think on a sort of speaking to MDRC's mission, is really a continued focus, which we have seen in some research, but on looking at PBL's implementation and effectiveness in underserved student populations. So making sure that there are opportunities for PBL to be offered to students in schools, in sort of more underprivileged schools, where, and really in the research world, understanding, what does implementation look like there? How might it be different? And what's its effectiveness among various subgroups will be really important to moving the research field forward.
Right, which brings me to my last question here, and sort of a two-part question, because I'm curious what your response might be if or when, a school administrator, superintendent, building principal, something like that might say, so should I implement PBL? Should I do PBL at my school? But I'm also curious if is that answer different, or why, what is different about if it is from, sort of matching the mission of MDRC is if it's a low income sort of underserved population school, if they say, should I do PBL? And so what might your answers be, and are they different, and perhaps why?
That's a great question. I'd say based on the research, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that PBL is a promising approach, and some solid evidence behind some specific curricula and some, solid research in the learning sciences about why it would affect student outcomes. So I think there's a lot of things we try, particularly in underserved schools, that don't necessarily have rigorous evidence behind them. So You know, I think that's important to keep in mind. I don't think I could say at this stage, particularly because really the research hasn't been done on, you know, all of those student subgroups, to be able to say, yes, this will work in your school, which may be facing a lot of needs. But I think we do know from the research, you know, some best bets of, you know, regarding if you're going to do PBL, here are some, you know, make sure your teachers have a unified vision of what they know PBL, what PBL is, that there is professional development and support there to help them in planning and implementation. And that I think, you know, just will be really important that there's, you know, a look at along the way at its effectiveness and sort of that critical feedback loop within a school or within a district to really consider its effectiveness. And I will say that, you know, given the large body of work that is currently going on, I think as we continue to move forward, there will be more evidence out there to help administrators and school districts really make those kinds of tough decisions when deciding instructional approaches to adopt.
Yeah, I think you make some really great points. And, you know, from my perspective, I think one of the things that hopefully, well, I think needs to change and is certainly a friction point for doing really great PBL is some of the, you know, sort of curriculum, rigid curriculum and scripted and pacing guides and the calendars, those kinds of things, and the sort of specter of accountability that makes it really threatening to try something different. And the maybe one of the biggest dangers as PBL and this sort of approach starts to gain some momentum is that it may not be done with a high level of efficacy in most places, which then means the test scores may in fact go down, which means that legislators and people who may not understand all of the nuances of what needs to happen and what is happening say, well, let's just reduce this more and tightly control it more and hold people and teachers more accountable. And of course, that ecosystem starts to spiral the other way. So anyways, Barbara, I'm really, I mean, I could talk about this for hours and hours because it's really fascinating to me. I appreciate your time and your thinking today.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening. And if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.